Hi, my name is Bob Wheeler, and welcome to the Berean Observer, where we search the scriptures daily to see whether or not these things are true. In recent years, I know that the testimony of the church has been damaged a little bit by pastors who've been caught in scandals, sometimes financial scandals, sometimes sexual scandals, and in some cases, sometimes even at a local level, you'll find that a relatively local church will find itself where a pastor makes some bad decisions and the church winds up splitting and people wind up getting disaffected and leaving. You've had cases where there have been well-known pastors who've wound up leaving the faith altogether and deconverting. And it could be argued that part of the problem is the way that our modern institutional church is set up. Pastors are trained in academic institutions. They're then brought in from the outside. And church decides whether or not to call them as a pastor, but they do so without really knowing why it is that what the man's personal life is like. And then the church itself tends to function on an executive business model, where you have the church as one pastor. If it's a large church, it might have a senior pastor, and then he's kind of like the CEO, the one in charge. And very often he's put into a position of authority where there's little or no accountability. He kind of runs the show, and people just kind of go along with what he says. And then we've had some cases where sometimes a son will take kind of a well-known ministry, and the son will take over the ministry from the father after the father passes away. And the problem is that people aren't asking the question, does this person really have the gifts and the graces necessary to be a good pastor? Does he meet the biblical qualifications for the eldership, you see? And so then that all raises the question then, so how is the church supposed to function? And how is a pastor supposed to shepherd a flock? And so it turns out that today we come to a passage in 1 Peter where Peter actually addresses that issue. And here's what he says, reading from 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 1 through 4. Reading from the New King James Version. The elders who are among you I exhort, I who am a fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, and also a partaker of the glory that will be revealed. Shepherd the flock of God which is among you, serving as overseers, not by compulsion, but willingly, not for dishonest gain, but eagerly, nor as being lords over those entrusted to you, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the crown of glory that does not fade away. So before we dive in and take a close look at it, let us go to God in prayer. Our Father, as we come before you, we have to confess that we are weak and frail and feeble Christians, and that we often fail to do your will. And we would ask now that as we would look at this passage of Scripture, that you would speak to our hearts, that you'd open our eyes, that you enable us to see your will for us in it. And we ask for this in Jesus' name. Amen. Now, once again, I should explain that before we take a look at this passage, we need to look at the historical context, as we've talked about this before, where the way that the church was structured or functioned back in the first century was that the entire Christian community within a given metropolitan area was considered to be a single church. And of course, it goes without saying you didn't have different denominations and so on. And this metropolitan church would be led by a group of elders, a plurality of elders. These elders were chosen from within the local church, so they weren't trained externally and brought in from the outside, but the congregation would look at certain men within their own congregation, their own church, and they would try to determine whether or not this person would be really called to be an elder, and then recognize them as such. And so it is that, and then of course within this larger metropolitan church, you'd have smaller groups that would meet on a weekly basis in private homes. Now then, so first of all, how does Peter describe himself as he's writing here? And he says, the elders who are among you I exhort, I who am a fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, and also a partaker of the glory that will be revealed. So first of all, he kind of identifies himself as a fellow elder. And it's kind of interesting that he would do that because, he was an apostle. In some ways, you can almost argue that he was the chief of the apostles. And yet he He doesn't try to, exercise authority, lord it over the other elders, but rather he basically puts himself in the same category with them. He says, I am a fellow elder. But he also then points out that he was a witness of the sufferings of Christ. And I think sometimes it's kind of hard to put ourselves in Peter's shoes and imagine what it must have been like to have followed Jesus for 3 years, sat at his feet, listened to his teaching, and then to actually watch the horrible execution taking place and the deep impression that must have left on his mind, and all the personal interactions that he had with Christ all along. And yet that's Peter's writing as someone who actually was in that position. And then it says he's also a partaker of the glory that will be revealed. And here again he points out that he puts things in a bigger context, that when it talks about the glory that will be revealed, he's talking about the second coming of Christ. And so the idea there is that, that he and all the elders will someday look forward to the second coming of Christ, and that's the thing that really counts. It's not all about how we can get ahead and be successful right here and now in this life, but rather it's what will we expect to receive when Christ returns. So then he goes on and he urges the elders that he's writing to follow his own example. So first of all, let's take a look at how he describes the nature of the pastoral ministry. So he says, shepherd the flock of God which is among you, serving as overseers. And then later on he says, being examples to the flock. So what he's doing here is that he's comparing the pastoral ministry with shepherding a flock of sheep. And in fact, our English word pastor actually comes from the Latin word pastor, which literally means shepherd. And so it's not so much about, running an institutional church and, boosting attendance and, finances and that kind of thing. But rather, he compares it to the work of a shepherd who is responsible for taking care of the sheep. Okay? And it's interesting that Jesus himself, back in John chapter 10, describes himself as the good shepherd. And he says, just a second here, in John chapter 10, in verses 11 through 15, he says, and this is Jesus speaking, he says, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd gives his life for the sheep. But a hireling, he who is not the shepherd, one who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees. And the wolf catches the sheep and scatters them. The hireling flees because he is a hireling and does not care about the sheep. I am the good shepherd, and I know my sheep, and I am known by my own. As the Father knows me, even so I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. And so the idea there is that Jesus was basically comparing himself with a shepherd, and that basically he was there to care for the sheep, and he was even willing to lay down his life for the sheep because he cared about their well-being. And so basically that's what a pastor or the shepherd, of a local church does. He's there to care for the people in his congregation, the flock. He's looking out for their spiritual well-being. He's making sure that they're being fed from the Word. He's making sure that they're being protected from danger and that he's leading them along. And then he goes on to describe the motives for the pastoral ministry. So why should somebody go into the ministry at all? Why become a pastor? So he says, first of all, he says, serving as overseers, not by compulsion, but willingly. Now, here again, I think the context is probably a situation where, again, you'd be talking about men who'd be called upon from within the congregation, would be called upon by their fellow Christians, their members, to take on the responsibilities of being an elder or a pastor, a bishop in the local church. And for some people, they might have been reluctant to do that because it could have been quite an inconvenience to them. They might have had to give up, whatever the secular business that they were involved in, or would have laid some additional burdens and responsibilities on them. And he says, no, it's something that you should be able to do willingly. That you feel that this is something which God has called you to do. It's a real privilege and an honor to be able to serve Him, and to be in a position like that. But then he also says, not for dishonest gain, but eagerly. And here we're coming a little bit closer to home, okay? That it shouldn't be, you shouldn't do it for the money, or maybe the fame, or the reputation, but rather you should do it because it's a way to serve Christ, and you're doing it eagerly and voluntarily. It's not because of what you think you can get out of it, especially not monetarily, but rather it's because it's something because you generally want to serve Christ, and you generally care about the members of the flock, and so you're willingly to do them. You do it out of a sense of love and not out of self-entitlement or self-promotion. Then he goes on to say, discuss, just a second here, the manner of the pastoral ministry. So once you're in the ministry, how do you go about doing it? And so what he says here, he says, not as being as lords over those entrusted to you, but being examples to the flock. And here again, I think that sometimes the modern ministry is a little bit faulty, and that we have this one person who was the elder, the pastor, or maybe the senior pastor in a larger church, and then basically he's in charge and he runs the show, and basically he expects people to jump at his command. And but he says specifically, Peter says, not as being lords. In other words, it's not you don't lord it over. You don't act in a domineering sort of a way. And then he goes on to say that he says that they're supposed to be examples, not being lords over those who are entrusted to you. And here again, it's a little bit what would happen is that when these large metropolitan churches that you would have had in the first century, what apparently happened is that these various elders would be entrusted to, they'd be responsible for given responsibility for certain smaller groups within the larger metropolitan church. And so those are the ones that you're pastoring. But he says, not being lords over them, but being examples to the flock. In other words, they say actions speak louder than words. And so the question is, when the members of the congregation look at you, what do they see? Do they see what a Christian should be look like? Should they see the Spirit of Christ himself? Do they see the fruit of the Spirit? Do they see the gentleness, the patience, the love, the long-suffering that he should look like? And the spirit of self-sacrifice. And in a sense, that says a lot more than anything you could say from the pulpit. You need to be a living example of the kind of thing that you're talking about. And then he goes on in verse 4 to kind of point to the eternal reward that we expect to see. It says, and when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the crown of glory which does not fade away. And of course, he talks about the chief. It's interesting because he's referring to Christ as the chief shepherd, okay? So it's like pastors are all pastors, but Jesus is the chief shepherd, okay? And so he's the leader of the whole group of shepherds. And basically when he appears, of course, that would be his second coming. And he says, we will receive the crown of glory that does not fade away. And here when he's using the word crown, in the Greek is Stephanos, it basically would be talking like the kind of a laurel wreath that would be given to like the winner of an Olympic game, something like that. And of course the problem with that is that it would fade away and disappear, and after a couple of months it basically doesn't exist anymore. But when Christ returns, those of us who have been faithful in serving Christ the way he wants us to would wind up basically receiving a crown that will last forever. And so it's a permanent reward. So what are the practical applications of this then? Well, first of all, for pastors, the question is, are you conscious of serving Christ, the chief shepherd? Are you consciously seeking his will? Are you spending time in prayer, asking him to guide you and to show you what he wants you to do? And then second of all, are you setting a good example for your flock? Again, can they see Christ living in you? Can they see the fruit of the Spirit? Do they see that patience, that humility, and that gentleness? And then, or are you being driven by your own ambition, that you're out to, make a reputation for yourself and to produce the numbers, to boost church attendance so that people will see you as this brilliant, successful pastor? And then for the congregations, the question is that when you go to call someone as a pastor, first of all, are you praying about it? Are you asking that God would send you someone after his own heart, a truly godly Christian, a man who really has a deep personal relationship with God himself and is spiritually minded? And are you looking for a man who has the necessary gifts and graces that meets the biblical qualifications for an elder? And here I'd have to say, in my own personal experience, I've had the misfortune of sitting under the ministry of some men, and after you listen to them for a while, it became kind of painfully obvious that they weren't really called to the ministry at all and shouldn't have been there. I think part of the problem is that almost anybody can, if they can pay their tuition, they can go to a Bible college or a seminary. And then when they graduate, the church just automatically assumes that this person is qualified to be a pastor, and they call them and they find out that in some cases the person just plain doesn't have the gift of teaching. And in other cases, his own personal life might leave a lot to be desired. So the question is, does this person meet the biblical qualifications for an elder? Okay? Then another thing that you should think about is to consider changing your church government to include a plurality of elders. I think part of the problem with a lot of the modern churches is that they only have one elder, one pastor, or if it's a large church, they have like a pastoral staff that's led by a senior pastor. And the problem is that these men very often aren't very accountable to anyone. Whereas if you do it in a more biblical way, that you have a plurality and a parity of elders, then they in turn can draw on their collective wisdom to make decisions which are hopefully wise. And then second of all, they can hold each other accountable. And so, with that exhortation, I would certainly hope that we'll go forward with a fresh commitment to serve Christ and to do what we can to please Him in the way that we conduct our church's life. So thanks for listening, and we hope that you'll tune in again soon. Thank you. Bye.